Back in the 1980s, there was a young man in Cuba. His name was Herodes Gutierrez Aguilera. And Herodes had two compelling dreams, two visions for his life. One was to become a doctor. He passionately wanted to become a doctor and to help people. His second dream was to come to the United States of America. He wanted to be in a land where people are free to talk. People are free to criticize the government. They're free to do all of the things that we take for granted here in the United States. And he so much wanted to do that, and he dreamed of doing that someday. As he graduated from their equivalent of high school, and he had his dreams. He wanted to get into medical school, and he studied and he prepared. He did all the things that he could do, because in order to get into colleges, advanced teaching in Cuba at that time, one had to pass a very rigorous entrance exam, and he was afraid that he wouldn't pass the entrance exam. And one day in the library while he was studying, his friend Rebecca noticed his anxiety, and she said, "Herodes, if you have a problem on the test that you don't know the answer to, just ask God for help." And that took him by surprise, but he was in communist Cuba, where religion was looked at as the opiate of the masses, and was discouraged. And he had never been exposed to that thought before, that you could turn to a higher power for help. And it stayed in the back of his mind. He didn't do anything about it. He just let it sort of sit there. But then in the middle of the test, he came to a problem that he couldn't even understand the problem. It was one of those math problems where it's a paragraph and you have to, he couldn't even figure out what the problem was. And so he set that aside and he continued in the test, and he returned to it, and he still couldn't even identify the problem. And what came for him in that moment was perhaps to try what his friend Rebecca had suggested. And so he didn't know how to pray, so he just said, "God, whoever or whatever you are, I want to become a doctor. And in order to become a doctor, I have to get admitted. And in order to do that, I have to pass this test. And I know that I need to answer this question correctly. So God, help me." And he left it at that. And he continued with a couple more problems. And he went back to that problem and instantly knew what the problem said. He knew what it was. He didn't know how to solve it. He didn't know what the answer was, but he knew what the question was. And 2 weeks later, the results of the tests were posted on the university board, and he went down and looked, and he had passed by the 1 point earned by that problem. It reminds me of an incident we had in our practitioner class this last week. One of our students, who was going to remain nameless, but instead her name is Zoe Bigelow, also had an exam. And so she prayed. This is an important exam, and so she prayed to get 100% on this exam. And the next week she reported she got 100% on the exam. So congratulations, Zoe. But there's actually another chapter in this. She really missed 3 questions. But there were 3 questions on the test that almost every student did not get right. And the professor looked at that and said, if everybody got it wrong, then I must not have taught it correctly. So I'm going to add 3 points to everybody's score. So Zoe's 97 became her prayed for 100. So good for you, Zoe. Well, Herodes got into medical school, and he advanced through. He was in his third year. The pressures of school were on him. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. He knew that he wanted to be a doctor, but he didn't see how a plan of perhaps coming to the United States could be part of God's plan for him. And he really didn't know what to do. There were a lot of pressures at that year of medical school as he did all of his medical studies, and he needed a break, so he went to his grandmother's house in Playa Largo, and north part of Cuba. And he got up early on a Saturday morning and he went out to fish in the surf, and he was casting into this surf and bringing in his line, and a big gust of wind hit him, and the salt spray came to his face, and he turned down to keep the salt out of his eyes, and he looked down and there was a bottle at his feet. And he thought that was strange, and he reached down and picked up the bottle, and he noted that there was a note or something inside. So he quickly reeled in his line and he took it over to the beach, and he found a rock. There's no way he could get the cork out, and he broke the bottle, and inside was a note. And this note said that the bottle had been thrown into the Atlantic off Cape Cod 3 years and a half earlier by a family known as the Litskys. They were from Henderson, Minnesota, and they had traveled to Cape Cod, and they had thrown several of these bottles into the ocean, and they asked anyone who found them to write them back, and they could keep track of the bottles. So he couldn't wait to get back to school to his English-Spanish dictionary so that he could look it up and write back to them. So he did that, and they established a communication. And then he started thinking about that. What are the chances 3.5 years later for me on that day on that beach? Is this a sign? Is this part of God's will for me? Is this part of what I am to be doing? Well, nothing really happened. In order to leave Cuba at that time, you had to enter a lottery, and they weren't allowing professionals to leave. They weren't allowing medical students or anyone with any kind of training like that to leave. But he did apply, and one day a neighbor ran up and excitedly said, Aretas, you've been selected. Selected for what? You've been chosen in the lottery to emigrate to the United States. And he was amazed that he had been, and he wondered then, perhaps this is part of God's plan for me, part of God's will. It took months and months for his application to go through, and the first wave of immigrants to be qualified to get to go. And during that period of time, he began to have remorse. He wondered, oh no, I'm going to have to leave my people. I'm going to have to leave my family and the people that I love. But it's my dream. Which is true? Do I leave or do I go? What do I do? How do I know? And then the second part of this, the second part came. This was another shout from a neighbor. And the neighbor said, oh, there it is. Naelis has been chosen also. Well, who's Naelis? Oh, that is my granddaughter, and she has been chosen as well. Oh, who is, your granddaughter? How do I get to meet her? I do not know. He said, but she too is a student at the university, a medical student at the university. And he was shocked to learn that there was a young lady that was also a student that had also been selected and happened to be in his wave of immigrants to the United States. And he really hoped to meet her, but he didn't know how or where he was going to meet her. And it got on the day that they went for his final interview, and there were 2 people in there, and he looked across the room, and he knew that was Naelis. And he said, Naelis? And she said, Aretas? And they had heard of each other. And so he thought, this is another sign. This is another indication that this is God's will. He doesn't have to leave everyone in Cuba. Part of Cuba is going to go with him to the United States. And over the months while they waited for the final thing, they became fast friends. And as they sat next to each other on the plane, as it roared down the runway and finally lifted off, he'd never been in a plane before, and the fright was behind him, and he looked down, and he and Naelis were holding hands. They arrived in the United States. They lived in Louisville, Kentucky, and while they prepared to be accepted into medical school in the United States, she worked as a maid in a hotel, and he worked in a glass factory, and they kept in contact with the Litskys in Henderson, Minnesota. And in 1998, the Litskys sent the funds to Aradis and Naelis to come to Minnesota, and he got to see snow for the first time. But he was open to God's will. He was open to something greater. So the title of my talk today is Thy Will Be Done. As some of you undoubtedly remember and know, 40 years ago today, the Anchorage Church of Religious Science received its charter from the United Church of Religious Science in Los Angeles, and we became an affiliated center, an affiliated church with home office. And I find that unique that was 40 years ago this very day. We got ready for celebrations. We were going to try and weave some of that into the ordination, and I think we got a little bit of it in there. We recognized this day, but this whole today really hasn't got off the ground the way I had hoped. There's so many other things going on. There's so many other stuff going that the big celebration for today really never caught on. And as what occurred to me, yes, I think it's appropriate today that we pause. And I forgot to ask you, Jenna, please, you got to bail me out again. When we have the kids come out, let's sing happy birthday to ourselves. I asked Zoe to make a Zoe cake. So let's have Zoe birthday cake. We'll sing happy birthday to ourselves. And we have a whole year to celebrate our 40th year. And it's appropriate that we look back and we do celebrate what has been accomplished and what's been done. But I think more importantly, maybe we should consider what's going to happen the next 40 years. What is God's will for us as a group, a collective, for the next 40 years? The 3 points that I am going to talk about today, one is my will, second is God's will, and the third point is one will. There are two components of what I'm calling my will. One is my conditioned will. And it's the will of my conditioned past. It consists of the experiences and the circumstances of our lives up to now. It's all of the things that have happened to us that have melded us into who we are today. It includes anything that's unhealed in our lives. All of those childhood traumas, the things that we think that have scarred us so badly, those are all part of our small will, our conditioned will. It has a personal agenda. It's propelled by old habit patterns, and they assert themselves into reality. It's the will that demands that things be better, more, or different in order for us to be happy. Oh, if I only had that car, I'd be happy. If only I met Mr. Right, I'd be happy. It's that part of us that's our will. It rejects what is and causes tension in our body. It's the will that denies our reality and tries to get something instead, that tries to fill the void with something else. Now there's a second part of my will, and that is my truest, most authentic will. And our truest, most authentic will is what lies in the gaps between the unhealed portions of our lives, between our conditioned past and the experiences and circumstances which have led us there. There are gaps between those experiences, and it is in those gaps that our truest, most authentic will lives. It is in these gaps that we discover our truest and deepest will and nature. Our nature, and our nature is the nature of God. The nature of God and God's will are the same. Thus, we are invited to move into that place. This is when we feel most alive and most complete. The advantage to our true will being in the gap is that we are given the opportunity to grow into it. We don't have to stay in our past. We don't have to stay in that in which we believe that we came from. We can grow into something greater. We have a foundational will, which is a divine will, God's will, but we get to create who we are. Carl Rogers said, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I can change." And it is only when we accept things as they are that we can change. When we accept our past, love it, and move forward, then we are able to move into that gap with ease and grace, knowing what it is. So my second point, God's will. God's will is in deep communion with life exactly as it is. It is that which was within us that gives itself wholeheartedly, wordlessly, and silently to the present moment. It is not out there somewhere or up there somewhere. It is within, constantly within. It is the good that is in all of us. Each and every one of us is imbued with goodness, and it is that goodness. It is always for us. It is never against us. Since God's will and God's nature are identical, God's will for us is joy, wholeness, peace, harmony, abundance, wisdom, freedom, clarity, and love. Ernest Holmes wrote, "True prayer must be, 'Thy will be done.' But the implication relative to the will of God in this prayer is not a submission to the inevitability of evil or limitation. It is a knowledge that the will of God is always good." So my third point, finally, one will. There are not two separate wills. There is only one, and it is one and the same will of God. God does not test us or give us trials or tribulations, doesn't give hurdles for us to get over or things to overcome. When we make choices in our lives based on our past experiences from our conditioned self, then it leads to bondage and fear. There are no bad choices. There are only choices that lead to what we don't want. When we focus on the lack or what is in our past, when we make choices, we get more lack or more of what was in our past. But there are never any wrong paths. If we are alive, we're on the right path. And if we are not, we're still on the right path. Just a new one.
Good news.
When we make choices based on the here and now and from the essence of our higher self or God's self, we are in alignment with God's will. God's will and my truest, most authentic will are the same. Once again, returning to Ernest Holmes, and it's the next paragraph after our sacred reading today. If the truth about God is happiness, joy, self-expression, and abundance, then this is the truth that which we should seek to demonstrate in our own lives. This is done by knowing that every thought within us abounds with peace, partakes of the divine bounty, includes the idea of wholeness, and is shot through with eternal light. So what I want everyone to take away today, the takeaway for this day, the conclusion. In the midst of what is happening right now is the divine will. This is the will of the heart. It is our deepest and most authentic will. As we let go of any resistance to the moment and any need to change it and allow ourselves to be fully present in this exact moment, then we come to realize that God's will and our truest will are one will. They are not separate. It is just like Aretas and what he experienced, the miracles of finding the bottle, of finding just the right person to help him make the transition to the United States. When we are in alignment with our highest good, those miracles happen for us. And so now I'd like to invite my colleagues, the prayer practitioners, to join me in holding our congregation in love and light, and in that awareness that each and every one of us are expressions of the Most High. Each and every one of us are beloved children of God. And that infinite intelligence, that divine creative force which is God, does indeed have a plan for us. It has a will for us, and that will is good. And that divine creative force is within each and every one of us, operating through and as each and every one of us. And so all of the good of God is ours here and now. It gives us the opportunity to release our past, to release the things that we feel may have defined who we are. We can let those fall away and just know that this divine plan, this God's will for each and every one of us, includes prosperity and abundance. It includes health. It includes wisdom. And most importantly, it includes love. Love in every facet of our lives. And so now we just step back and we allow God's will to operate through us for a richer, fuller, more expansive life. And so now I just give thanks. I give thanks for my awareness of God's will operating through me. I give thanks for my abundance, my prosperity, my health, and the love that I feel in my life at every moment with each and every one. So now it is simply just to step back and allow God to be God through and as everyone. We let it go, we let it be, and so it is.